Hello. So in this video we're going to finally take a look at taking off and getting this plane up in the air. Now I know what you guys are probably thinking. You're probably sat there thinking, about damn time. I know, I'm sorry, but I want to make sure that I can give you the most detailed tutorials that I can with this aircraft. In the last video we looked at the taxi procedures after getting the engine started, so let's look at a few more procedures before we take off. So the before takeoff procedure could actually be done towards the end of the taxi. These are just a few extra steps that need to be done just to ensure that the plane is ready for takeoff. So by the time you get to the end of the runway, you can do these steps during the taxi just to make sure that the plane is ready to go as soon as you reach the runway so you can make an immediate takeoff. So the first thing you want to check is the ECAM wheel page. Now, if no other pages are selected down here on the ECAM display, the wheel page will be automatically selected. What you want to check on this page is that the brake temperatures are underneath or less than 150 degrees centigrade, or Celsius rather. If the wheel temperatures are above 150, then what you can do is you can turn on the brake fan system by clicking on this button here next to the landing gear indicator. You see that we get a light on the button there, and we also get an indication on the upper ECAM display. So the reason we check the wheel temperatures is because sometimes this check needs to be done in the event that the plane has just undergone a rejected takeoff where the brakes would have been slammed on. Obviously the brakes would be really hot, so you just want to make sure that the brakes are within a safe temperature before you attempt to take off again. If the brake temperatures were above 150 and they're now below 150, then you need to turn off the brake fan, like so. Next, you want to make sure that the engine mode selector is in normal. This should have been done earlier on, but you just want to double check that before takeoff there. Next, you set the transponder to TARA mode. So this allows the transponder, or this gives the pilot traffic, collision and avoidance information there. So you just turn that on to TARA, which is rolling. So what you do is you put your mouse cursor over the rotating knob there and roll your mouse wheel forward until the little notch in the side there is reading next to TARA. Also on your nav display you'll get a little indication at the bottom of the nav display saying TA only. It says TA only at the moment because we're on the ground, but once we climb up to about 1,000 feet that will switch automatically into TARA mode. After setting the transponder, the next thing you want to check is to make sure that the weather radar is pointing in an upwards direction, so it's going to be picking up weather above the aircraft. So you can check that on the nav display here. In the bottom right corner you should see a little green number there, so that says plus 4.8. So you just want to make sure that that is pointing at least 4 degrees above the aircraft, so it's picking up any weather indications, at a higher altitude above the current level of the aircraft. And then one last thing to check before we reach the runway is to just double check the anti-skid and nose wheel steering switch. Just make sure that is up and in the on position there. Okay, so just as we round this corner, this is going to be the end of the runway here. So before I go onto the runway, I'm going to stop behind the taxiway hold line there.
Approaching 26.
Thank you, Ras. At this point, what you would do is you would then contact the airfield tower control to request clearance for takeoff. So at this point, you can decide to stop either by holding the brakes manually, or you can turn on the parking brake. It's completely up to you. So once you've received permission from air traffic control to enter the runway, the last couple of actions involve turning on various lights. So first of all, we would turn on the strobe lights. So you can put them into the auto position or on, either or will be fine. Next you can turn on the landing lights, so you can turn the main lights to on. You can also turn on the runway turn off lights and also move the nose wheel lights up to the takeoff position. And just as you begin moving onto the runway you can switch all of those lights on as you move onto the runway there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn to the left and taxi all the way down to the very end of the runway. So as I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of cut the video here before we take off, because there's a very important feature in the Airbus that I need to talk about, I need to explain briefly before we take off, and that is something called the flight mode annunciator.
08900 feet remaining.
Thank you, Russ, again, interrupting me. So the flight mode annunciator is this little area at the very top of the primary flight display. You can see we've got 5 sort of columns here, and these columns will display different pieces of information depending on what the aircraft is doing. So what I'm going to do is just cut the video very quickly just to highlight some of the information that you will see in this display. So each of the 5 columns which make up the FMA represent specific systems. For example, the first column represents auto thrust settings. Remember how the throttles have those detents which represent takeoff and go around power, flex power and climb power. You'll see different modes show up in the first column depending on the throttle setting. You will also see indications of the speed or Mach hold modes. You may also see flashing white text advising you, the pilot, to move the throttle levers into a specific position. The next column represents the vertical autopilot modes. These are modes which provide vertical guidance to the plane to make sure it's at its correct height for a given point along the flight path. So if you remember that we have some altitude constraints along our departure, we'll see some of these vertical guidance modes changing in this column during the departure. The third column in the center represents lateral autopilot modes. So these are the modes which ensure that the aircraft is in the correct position over the ground, and it will also essentially point the aircraft in the right direction. Again, you will see these modes changing during the departure. The fourth column will display information relating to instrument approaches, so we're not going to see anything in the cockpit for a couple of videos until we come in for a landing at Inverness. And the last column indicates the status of the autopilot and flight director, showing when those systems are enabled. So a couple of extra things to note. You'll notice that the FMA displays text in different colours. Basically, green text indicates that a flight mode is currently active, blue text indicates that a flight mode has been armed, and white text is general information. Also, when a new flight mode is enabled, you will see the mode outlined with a white box for a couple of seconds as confirmation that the mode has just been enabled. If you want to read about the FMA and each flight mode in more detail, you can find information about it in the documentation which comes with the aircraft. If you look at the system PDF, which is volume 4, you will find detailed FMA information on page 43. If you want to read about each specific flight mode, you can find information on those starting at page 12 in the same document. Anyway, back to the flight. Okay, so before we take off, there's a couple of things that I want to talk about very quickly. You'll notice on my screen that I've got a couple of zoomed in views of the primary flight display, the nav display, and also the upper ECAM. So on the primary flight display, if we have a look at the flight mode annunciator, you can see that we've got several modes are armed and active. We've got the climb mode and nav mode, which are armed. Now, once we take off, these will automatically arm, and you'll see that we get those white boxes and the green text will start popping up mainly along the top row of the FMA here. You can also see that we've got flight directors 1 and 2 are switched on currently as well. Also on the attitude indicator, you can see that we've got some extra markings here. If I wiggle my controls, my joystick, you can see that we've got this little white crosshair. So all this is doing is this is telling me where I'm, sort of pointing the joystick essentially. Now, once we start rolling, what we want to do is we want to push the joystick forward, or the controls forwards, about halfway to about that position there. Because what that will do is, as the plane accelerates, that will prevent the nose from tipping up and tipping the whole plane tipping backwards. So as we start rolling, we're going to push the nose down, and then once we reach about 80 knots, then we're just going to let the controls come back to center, and then once we reach our rotate speeds, then we'll lift up slowly and lift the plane up into the air. Now, when you rotate, you don't want to force the plane into the air. You just want to pull it back to about maybe 5 degrees, maybe 5 to 7.5 degrees, and then just let the plane naturally tilt up. Don't try and force the plane up. Don't try and lift harder. Just lift the nose up gently, and then just let the plane slowly sort itself out, and it will make for a much smoother, much more sort of graceful takeoff there. Okay, so what I'm actually going to do for this tutorial is I'm actually going to run the video, or run the takeoff in slow motion essentially, and then narrate over the top of it afterwards. So there's some things that I'm going to try and point out before I take off, and then during the takeoff what I'm going to do is, as I edit the video, I'm going to run the video in slow motion and then talk about things as they're going. So before we take off, you can see that I've got the sort of takeoff checklist on the left hand side there. So that's both takeoff and a few after takeoff steps, and a lot of these are going to happen sort of in quick succession. Once we get to the stage where we enable the autopilot, then we kind of go through and do our after takeoff checks, which essentially is double checking that we've done everything that we need to after the takeoff. So for the takeoff roll, what we're going to do is we're going to move the throttles up to about 40%. Now if you have a look on the N1, on the central upper E-cam here, you'll notice that there's a sort of a blue dot which sits just outside of the N1 gauge. So if I move my thrust lever very quickly, you can see that kind of indicates where your thrust levers are. So you want to move that up to the approximately the 40%. Make sure that the engine gauges are all equal, they're all reading, they're all even, and then once you're happy that everything is okay there, then move the thrust levers up to the flex or takeoff go around detents, whichever one you're using for this. Now if you're not sure which you need, whether it's takeoff or flex, you'll usually get a little indication here if you selected the wrong one. So if you've chosen flex and you need the full takeoff go around power, then you'll get a little notification here, you'll get a little audible warning, a little kind of bong sound in the cockpit, so you just move the throttles up to that position. Also, sort of opposite to that, if you have put the throttles into the toga position but you can get away with using flex, again the aircraft will kind of give you a little bong warning and it will say move the throttles into flex in this column here. So so you can do that very quickly as soon as you start rolling for takeoff. And then the other thing that you need to do is, once you've applied takeoff power, whether that's toga or flex power, you also need to start the timer. Now the reason that pilots do this is because you can only run the engines at maximum power for a limited amount of time. It just saves wear and tear on the engines. So I believe in the Airbus, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think takeoff go around power, you're limited to running the engines at a maximum of 5 minutes on takeoff go around power, and then on flex power it is, I think, 10 minutes continuous at that speed there. Okay, so I think we are ready to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to release the parking brake, and then we'll go up to about 40% thrust. Once I'm happy that everything's normal, then I will accelerate up, or I'll increase up to flex power. You'll also see some pop-ups or some new announcements on the FMA here, and I'll talk about those. I'll sort of narrate over those afterwards. So yeah, here we go. Okay, so immediately I accidentally miss a couple of steps, so I forget to push the controls forward to prevent the aircraft from tilting during acceleration, and I also forget to start the chrono or the timer there during the takeoff. But we all make mistakes. This is part of learning. So here in the cockpit, what I do is you can see I start moving the throttles up to about 40%, and then just give it a couple of seconds just to let the engines start spooling up, make sure the engines are responding to my thrust inputs, and then I move them all the way up to the flex detent. Now if you have a look at the primary flight display, you can see that we've got manual flex plus 62 degrees, so that shows us that we're in the flex takeoff setting. We've got SRS, which is the takeoff mode, and we've also got runway, which is another takeoff mode there. On the right hand side, you can also see that auto throttle is now armed. So you can see we begin accelerating, and everything is working well there. You can see we've also got a green vertical bar on the primary, on the attitude indicator. So that is basically just a runway guidance, just to make sure that we track the center line of the runway there. So you can see on the speed tape now we're approaching V1, so that's our V1 speed. We just passed that, so we are now committed to takeoff. Our rotate speed is the blue dots there, just underneath the sort of magenta triangle there. So as we hit rotate, you can see that I lift the nose up to just about the horizontal bar in the flight director. That's roughly where you want to move your controls there. So I just hold it in that position, let the nose rise, and the aircraft will take off very gracefully. So once you've done that, you check the vertical speed indicator, make sure you are going up, and then when you've got confirmation of that, you can raise the landing gear. And then now it's just a case of tracking the flight director just to make sure you make a safe climb away from the runway there. So you can see I just start turning to the left ever so slightly just to bring the flight director back into the center position. Now during this time also what you would want to do is you'd also want to disarm the ground spoilers at this point. I didn't do it at this point of the recording, I did it a bit later on. But normally, as soon as the landing gear is up, then you would want to disarm the ground spoilers there. So now you've got a little bit of respite. All you really want to do is just follow the flight director, just make sure that the plane is climbing safely away from the runway. Now you can see that the flight director is telling me to turn to the left, so I do begin to turn left. You'll also notice on the FMA that I start getting a lever climb warning on the left there, or a little notification. So what I do is I move the throttles into the climb position, so that's just one kind of notch down, and you can see that the plane now enters thrust climb modes and also climb mode on the second column there. You can also see that the flight director is also telling us to pitch the nose down, so that kind of gives the plane the ability to accelerate and gain speed. So once you've done that, once you've moved the thrust levers into the climb position, then you want to enable the autopilot, which I do just there. You'll see on the left hand side, or sorry, the right hand side of the FMA, we've got AP1 is now enabled. So you can use either autopilot 1 or autopilot 2, it doesn't matter, but once the autopilot is enabled, now you are completely hands free. You can take your hands off the throttle, take your hands off the controls, the plane is now flying itself. And now I've got an opportunity to do my after takeoff checks. So you can see I just got rid of the views there just to give myself a bit of a clearer view. So I disarm the spoilers now, that's what I just clicked on there. Check the thrust levers, make sure they are in the climb detent there. And then next what I do is I just check the airspeed very quickly, just make sure we are at a safe speed, and then I reduce the flaps by 1 setting. You'll notice that the nose dips down as I do that because we're losing a bit of lift. And you can see that the plane will start to accelerate again because we're reducing the amount of drag caused by the flaps there. And then I just check the speed again. Yep, I'm happy that we're flying fast enough, and I'll reduce the flaps, or bring the flaps all the way up back into the 0 or the up position there. And you can see I'm just checking the ECAM for confirmation. Okay, and then we go back into full speed mode, so to speak. So this is just after takeoffs, we're just double checking everything. So engine mode selector is normal, spoilers have been disarmed, flaps are up, check the landing gear is up, and our lights are all off. That means everything's good there. Then we can reduce our external lights, so we turn the nose light off, we turn the runway turn off lights off, and we also double check the packs to make sure that those are working fine. And also at this point, if you needed anti-ice, you would check that as well, but we don't need it. So yeah, the plane is now doing everything we want it to do, so we're just going to continue along the departure. Okay, so you can see that we're just about to hit this waypoint, the BNN09 here. So what we want to do is we want to dial the altitude up to 6,000 feet, and if we hit that there, you'll notice that we get a little mode saying that we're on an altitude constraint, but climb mode is armed. So once we pass this waypoint, then we're going to climb up to the next sort of altitude constraints along the departure. So we've just passed that there. You can see the plane is now climbing. It's in speed mode, and then it's going to be held by an altitude constraint again there. You can see the altitude hold there's at 6,000 feet. So the airplane is now currently in speed hold mode, which is 250 knots because we're below 10,000 feet, and we're in altitude constraints, and it's in nav as well there. And you can see also that we've got autopilot 1, flight directors 1 and 2, and the auto throttle systems all are enabled. Now, if you were flying if you're flying with air traffic control and they give you an instruction, they say, okay, rather than stay at the 6,000 feet constraints, you're allowed to climb up to your cruise altitude now. Then what you can do is if you roll your altitude here up to the assigned altitude that they give you, then if you right click on the knob so that you pull the knob out, what will happen is the plane will enter an open climb mode, and you see that the thrust levers automatically go into climb, or the auto-throttle system goes into climb mode as well. Now you'll also notice here that we've also got QNH flashing here. So now that we've passed the transition altitude for Luton, which was 6,000 feet, we can set the barometric pressure to standard. So if we just go over to the barometric setting here, and then just right click on the grey knob, pull that out, it moves into standard. And that is all set, and that is all good. The last thing to do now is, once we pass 10,000 feet, will be to switch off the landing lights. So we're just coming up to 10,000 feet now, so we'll switch those off. And also, just as you pass through 10,000 feet, if you've got clearance now to sort of climb up to your cruise speed, if you're running with a passenger add-on, for example, then now would be a good time also to switch the seatbelt signs off to allow your cabin crew and your passengers to start moving about inside the plane. And that about covers everything for takeoff and the initial climb away from the airport. So I hope this video helped. As I said, there is a lot that happens during the takeoff procedure, so if you need to pause the simulator every few seconds just to understand what's going on and complete any actions that you need to, that is completely fine. You know, it's a simulator. You're allowed to make mistakes. You're allowed to pause and rewind and try again. So don't worry about any of that. So I hope this video helped. As always, I just want to say a quick thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. And yeah, the next video we'll be looking at what you need to do during the cruise with the Airbus, and we'll also start looking at the top of the descent and how we make our approach towards Inverness. So for now, thank you all very much for watching. Take care out there, and I will catch you all later.